Joel, what do you think of my analysis that if Bernie manages to, I don't mean to use the word humiliate, but demonstrate how wobbly Joe Biden is in a one-on-one debate this weekend, it could cause Democratic Party elders to say there's no way we can put Joe Biden up against Trump if he can't even fare well against Bernie Sanders.
Well, I think it's a little bit optimistic from a conservative point of view. It is possible that Bernie Sanders might have found a way to show the party that Joe Biden cannot hack it as the nominee and they should turn to the runner-up, who will be Bernie Sanders, to replace him. But I think Bernie Sanders may have something else in mind. And if I were a Democrat, I'd actually be quite pleased with what he did. He's trying to move Joe Biden further in his direction. He's trying to extract some kind of concessions or compromises on policy and maybe even personnel. Maybe Bernie Sanders wants some leverage over the vice presidential pick, for example. And with Joe Biden looking rather frail, the vice president will essentially be the true candidate. So perhaps Bernie Sanders is negotiating for more favorable terms of surrender. And if he's successful, and if Joe Biden doesn't collapse after 2 hours on stage, and I don't think he will, he may not look great, but he's made it through the previous debates, and so I think he'll be okay. If Bernie Sanders is successful and Joe Biden accepts some compromise terms that make it look like it was all worth it for Bernie Sanders and his supporters, then I think there's a greater chance that more Sanders people will come along in November with a Biden ticket. And so this is, in a way, a win-win proposal for both sides. Bernie gets to show his supporters he's still fighting for them, and Biden gets the opportunity to bring more of those supporters into his camp. Now, I'm not sure it will work. There's a lot of distrust. There's a sense that the Sanders effort was blocked in stunning fashion over the last 10 days by the sudden decision of all the other candidates, except Elizabeth Warren, of course, and the Democratic establishment, to oppose Bernie Sanders. Once Sanders was the front runner after Nevada, it looked like he was going to cruise to the nomination. The party kicked into gear. They were terrified he was going to lose and take Congress with him. So they all opposed him. They all lined up behind Biden, who had been a very weak candidate up to that point. The voters got the message. This is where they're supposed to be. Trump is correct, by the way. Trump tweeted that had Elizabeth Warren stepped out of the race and endorsed Bernie Sanders before Super Tuesday, it's possible Sanders would still be in the lead, because in some of the states where they were both competitive, the two of them, if you add their votes up, would have beaten Joe Biden. And if all of Elizabeth Warren's votes had gone to Bernie Sanders, or even a significant portion, he might have been the front runner still today. So this might have dragged on, and I think that the infighting will continue to some extent. But this is really an attempt, this offer by Bernie Sanders to continue the debate is an attempt to influence the Democrats' agenda. And if it is successful, it could help the Democrats a lot. I've been saying for several weeks now that even though Donald Trump has come into 2020 looking very strong, Democrats are going to make this race competitive as 2016 was, really. It's going to be that hard. Now with coronavirus, you have an additional level of uncertainty. It's not clear that Democrats will be able to exploit it politically, and they haven't really just yet. But whenever you create conditions that people feel uneasy about, you're creating the potential for political change. And so I think Democrats and the media are playing up the difficulty of the coronavirus challenge, which is serious and real, but they're playing it up, they're playing into it. And they like the panic. They're not shying away from it because they believe that the real national security threat is Donald Trump, and anything you do to remove Donald Trump is the right thing to do. So even though they might admit privately that they're overhyping this a bit, in their minds, it's in service of a good cause, which is getting rid of Trump. So I think you're going to see the instability continue through November. And I'm not sure, by the way, it ends after November if Trump loses, let's say, because I think Trump supporters will feel that this election will have been rigged, both by the impeachment and the coronavirus scare. I think you have a more stable outcome if Trump wins. It depends whether Democrats recognize that result, of course, but if Trump wins, then Democrats can no longer argue that 2016 was a fluke. Joe Biden has actually said over and over again, 2016 was an aberration. They refuse to acknowledge what the voters were telling them. And I think if Trump wins, they will finally have to acknowledge at least some of what motivated Trump supporters in that election. We'll see what happens. But the debate in Arizona, interestingly enough, will also be without an audience and without journalists. CNN and the Democratic National Committee have canceled the live audience, canceled the media filing center and the spin room because of concerns about coronavirus. Now, to me, that seems a bit excessive. Coronavirus is not spread like the measles. It's not highly contagious in an airborne way. It's not some sort of ambient illness you can just contract by being in the same room with somebody. It relies on person-to-person contact. It's contagious, but it relies on something more significant than simply being in someone else's proximity for a few seconds. So I think they're overdoing it a little bit, but they're going along with an effort which is partly driven by a genuine concern for risk and partly driven by a desire to shut things down so they have something to drive at Donald Trump in November.
That's an excerpt from my daily show, the Ezra Levant Show. Every day I do a monologue on the news of the day, then I interview an interesting guest, and then I read my hate mail. You gotta subscribe. Go to rebelnews.com.